In 1187, the world Richard the Lionheart would later enter had already ended. At Hattin, Saladin did not merely defeat a Crusader army, he erased it. The Frankish field host was annihilated, the true cross captured, and Jerusalem reclaimed. In one campaign, nearly a century of Christian dominance in the Holy Land collapsed. For Muslim commanders, the lesson was clear and reinforced by every engagement that followed. Frankish knights were terrifying in the charge, but brittle under pressure. Bleed them, bait them, let heat, thirst, and impatience do the killing. By 1191, this belief had hardened into doctrine. Saladin stood at the height of his power, commanding an empire that stretched from Egypt to Syria. His armies had adapted perfectly to Levantine warfare, mobile, resilient, and psychologically sophisticated. They did not need decisive battles. They specialized in erosion. Against them, every previous Crusader force had eventually snapped. Richard arrived into this reality with reputation but little margin for error. Acre had fallen after a brutal 2-year siege, but victory there solved nothing. His army was small by medieval standards, just 12,000 men, and already exhausted. They were deep in hostile territory, far from reinforcements, marching under a sun that killed as efficiently as any blade. Worse still, Saladin's forces had not been damaged in any meaningful way. The Sultan could replace losses. Richard could not. From a purely strategic standpoint, the situation was untenable. Saladin commanded roughly 30,000 warriors, many of them veterans, hardened by decades of campaigning. His horse archers had broken Crusader armies repeatedly by refusing decisive engagement. They attacked nerves, not shields. They punished movement. They exploited impatience. Every Crusader commander knew the outcome if discipline failed for even a moment. Conventional wisdom predicted only one ending. The Crusaders would march south. Saladin would harass them continuously. Arrows would accumulate. Horses would fall. Men would die without striking back. Eventually, a knight or an entire order would break ranks. Once that happened, Muslim cavalry would surround and annihilate the exposed force in detail. This was not theory, it was precedent, proven repeatedly since Hattin. Even Richard understood this. He knew Saladin's strengths. He knew the limits of heavy cavalry in heat and narrow terrain. He knew that one uncontrolled charge could doom the entire army. Yet he also understood something his enemies believed impossible. Discipline could be weaponized, not as defense, but as delayed violence. This is what makes Arsuf incomprehensible at first glance. It was not a victory born of surprise, superior numbers, or better ground. It was achieved by an army that should have collapsed days earlier, fighting an enemy who had already mastered the method that destroyed every other Crusader host. To understand why 12,000 men survived and why 30,000 would break, we must abandon the idea that Arsuf was won in 17 minutes. The outcome was decided long before a single trumpet sounded. The road from Acre to Jaffa looked harmless on a map. In reality, it was a weapon, one Saladin had been preparing to use long before Richard ever set foot in the Levant. The coastal route ran south for roughly 80 miles, squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea and the rising hills of Samaria. On the right, water blocked escape. On the left, broken terrain and wooded high ground concealed cavalry movements. There was no room for maneuver, no depth for retreat, and no possibility of flanking an enemy who controlled the heights. Any army marching this road would be visible, predictable, and vulnerable for days. When Richard chose this route, Saladin was pleased. The decision appeared cautious, even timid. Marching along the coast allowed the Crusaders to stay close to their fleet, ensuring supplies and water, but it also locked them into a narrow corridor where harassment could be constant and cumulative. Saladin had built his entire operational doctrine around exploiting exactly this kind of movement. At Hattin and countless lesser engagements, he had destroyed Frankish forces by letting geography do half the work. But this was not a contest between a reckless Crusader king and an ambush-hungry sultan. Both men were students of war and of each other. Richard had studied Saladin's victories carefully. He knew how Muslim cavalry avoided direct engagement, how arrows were used to provoke impatience, and how decisive moments were manufactured by baiting knights into breaking formation. Saladin, in turn, had interrogated captured Crusaders for years. He understood European cavalry doctrine intimately. He knew the power of a heavy charge and the catastrophic consequences when it was unleashed too early or too late. Each commander believed he understood the other's limits. Saladin assumed Richard would eventually be forced to act. No army, especially one composed of knights trained for offensive shock, could endure days of harassment without responding. Heat would magnify irritation. Casualties would inflame pride. Religious warriors watching comrades die without striking back would demand action. When discipline failed, and Saladin was certain it would, his cavalry would turn localized rashness into total destruction. Richard saw the same terrain and drew the opposite conclusion. The narrow road did not merely constrain him, it also constrained Saladin. Muslim cavalry could harass endlessly, but only as long as they avoided close combat. If they committed too deeply, if they massed too confidently, their mobility advantage would evaporate. The same corridor that trapped the Crusaders could become a funnel for concentrated force, if the moment was chosen precisely. This mutual confidence is what made Arsuf inevitable. Saladin gathered roughly 30,000 men in the hills overlooking the route, assembling them in stages so as not to reveal the full scale of his strength too early. He intended to escalate gradually, increasing pressure day by day until the Crusader army fractured. Richard, meanwhile, deliberately slowed his march, stretching what should have been 3 days into more than a week. To outside observers, this looked like indecision or weakness. In reality, both men were waiting for the other to blink. One believed discipline could not survive sustained suffering. The other believed patience could be sharpened into a blade. Between them lay a road soaked in heat, blood, and inevitability. On paper, the two forces approaching Arsuf represented opposite solutions to the same problem: how to kill effectively in the medieval world. In reality, they embodied two incompatible philosophies of war. Richard's army of roughly 12,000 men was small, but it was engineered for cohesion. At its core stood about 2,000 mounted knights, the heaviest shock troops of the age. These were not merely horsemen, they were armored systems. Each knight carried roughly 40 pounds of mail and equipment: helm, shield, lance, sword. Their horses, destriers bred for combat, were themselves weapons, trained to charge into chaos, bite, kick, and trample. but the knights were only decisive if employed together. Individually, they were vulnerable. Collectively, they were unstoppable. Supporting them were around 10,000 infantry. Half were spearmen tasked with maintaining a continuous shield wall. The other half were crossbowmen, whose bolts could punch through Muslim armor at range. Richard had fused these elements into a moving defensive box. Infantry on the outside, cavalry mounted but restrained within, crossbowmen protected at the center. The formation advanced as a single organism. It was slow, rigid, and mentally exhausting, but extraordinarily difficult to break. Most important of all, this formation required absolute discipline, no pursuit, no individual heroics, no response without command. Saladin's host of approximately 30,000 men was built on a different logic entirely. Mobility was its lifeblood. At its core were around 10,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood, superb horsemen with exceptional endurance. They wore lighter armor, optimized for speed and prolonged engagement rather than impact. Their primary weapons were composite bows capable of rapid fire, supported by curved sabers for close combat. The remaining forces were a mosaic: Bedouin light cavalry for scouting and harassment, Turkish horse archers, Kurdish infantry, and Egyptian regulars. What unified them was not formation, but freedom of movement. These men fought as individuals and small groups, relying on initiative, speed, and psychological pressure rather than cohesion. Saladin's true advantage lay not in killing power, but in erosion. His army did not need to destroy Richard's force outright. It only needed to provoke mistakes. Arrows were cheap. Horses were replaceable. Time favored the attacker who could inflict stress without committing fully. The asymmetry was stark. Richard's army was devastating only at the moment of release. Until then, it had to endure. Saladin's army was effective precisely because it never had to endure anything at all. It could disengage at will. This is why Saladin was confident. He had defeated Crusader armies before by exploiting exactly this imbalance. Knights were bred for violence, not restraint. Their psychology leaned toward decisive action. Saladin assumed that sustained harassment, noise, arrows, insults, and death without retaliation would eventually corrode even the strongest discipline. Richard, however, had designed his army to invert this expectation. His formation was not meant to win skirmishes. It was designed to absorb punishment while preserving killing power for a single, overwhelming moment. Every arrow that struck a shield instead of a man, every hour the line held without charging, increased the stored violence within the ranks. At Arsuf, these two systems were about to collide. One thrived on motion and fragmentation. The other depended on immobility and unity. One sought victory through cumulative pressure. The other gambled everything on timing. Only one of these philosophies could survive sustained contact. The march began on September 3rd, and with it, Saladin's preferred weapon was unleashed, not steel, but inevitability. As the Crusader column moved south from Acre, Muslim outriders appeared almost immediately on the hills to the east. They did not charge, they did not mass. They announced themselves, then vanished. Within hours, the first arrows began to fall. Not volleys, not decisive strikes, a constant, maddening drizzle meant to erode nerves rather than bodies. This was deliberate. Saladin understood the arithmetic of attrition better than any commander of his age. Every arrow did not need to kill. It only needed to land often enough to create the illusion of helplessness. The Crusaders were forced to march in full armor under a sun that pushed temperatures beyond human tolerance. Each step consumed water, each hour amplified exhaustion, and still they were forbidden to respond. Richard's formation held. Infantry formed the outer shell, shields locked, spears bristling outward. Crossbowmen waited for clear targets, firing sparingly to conserve bolts. The knights remained mounted, lances upright, absorbing the psychological insult of inaction. Arrows clattered harmlessly off mail and shields, until they didn't. Horses, unarmored and irreplaceable, began to fall. Men collapsed from heat. The march slowed. By the end of the first day, the pace had become absurdly slow. What should have been rapid progress turned into meters per hour. To outside observers, it looked like paralysis. To Saladin, it looked like pressure building toward collapse. Day 2 intensified the pattern. Muslim cavalry grew bolder, riding closer, loosing arrows at shorter range, then wheeling away. The sound was relentless. The whine of shafts, the thud against shields, the screams of wounded horses. This was not combat in the heroic sense. It was industrialized torment. And still, Richard refused to accelerate or retaliate. The reason was mathematical. Saladin's army possessed near unlimited arrows and fresh mounts. The Crusaders did not. Any attempt to chase harassers would fracture the formation and create isolated targets. Richard was trading short-term casualties for long-term cohesion. It was a brutal calculus, and every man in the ranks understood the cost. By the third day, Muslim sources recorded staggering arrow expenditure, hundreds of thousands loosed with little immediate effect. Crossbowmen inflicted losses in return, killing hundreds of attackers over time. But this only reinforced Saladin's confidence. He could afford these losses. Richard could not. The psychological strain was the real battlefield. Knights were bred to attack, trained from childhood to resolve danger through violence. Watching comrades die without striking back violated every instinct they possessed. Orders against charging were enforced under penalty of death. Discipline was no longer an abstract virtue, it was a survival mechanism imposed through fear. Richard rode constantly along the column, visible, armored, exposed like any other man. His presence mattered. Authority in medieval armies was personal, not institutional. Seeing the king endure what they endured kept the line intact. His orders were simple and repeated without variation. Hold formation, conserve strength, wait. Saladin misread this endurance as weakness. He believed the pressure was working, that the Crusaders were being slowly crushed by heat, thirst, and humiliation. He was correct about the suffering. He was wrong about its effect. By the end of the third day, the Crusader army was wounded, dehydrated, and furious, but still intact. More importantly, it had learned something about itself. It could endure what Saladin believed no Frankish force could survive. The suffering was no longer random. It was being absorbed, counted, and stored. By the fourth day, the march had become a test not of strength, but of identity. The heat intensified. September in the Levant meant temperatures that turned armor into furnaces. Men marched with tongues swollen from thirst, eyes burning from salt and dust. Horses foamed at the mouth and stumbled, their strength draining faster than their riders. The Crusader pace slowed even further, first to 8 meters per hour, then less. Every delay invited more punishment. Saladin escalated accordingly. The harassment became more aggressive, more personal. Muslim cavalry rode close enough for Crusaders to hear insults shouted in Arabic, close enough to see faces twisted in mockery. Arrows now targeted not just men, but horses and banners. Drums thundered constantly, a wall of sound meant to fracture concentration and fray nerves. The message was unmistakable: you are trapped, and you are dying slowly. The rear guard suffered most. The Templars, assigned to protect the column's back, endured relentless pressure. Forced to fight while retreating, they rode backward in their saddles, shields raised, presenting a wall of steel to pursuing horse archers. It was humiliating. These were men trained to lead charges, reduced to absorbing punishment in silence. But the formation held. Not everyone endured. As casualties mounted, individual knights began to crack. A man would spur forward, break ranks, and charge a tormentor. He never returned. Muslim cavalry swarmed isolated riders with surgical efficiency, cutting them down before wheeling away untouched. Their deaths were visible to the entire column, object lessons in what happened when discipline failed. Richard made no exceptions. Orders were absolute. No charge without the signal. Violations were met with execution. This was not cruelty, it was containment. One breach could unravel the entire army. Fear of punishment became a second line of defense, reinforcing formation where exhaustion threatened to dissolve it. By day 5, Saladin committed heavier forces. Harassment gave way to coordinated attacks, particularly against the vanguard. The Hospitallers, leading the column, absorbed the worst of it. Dead horses littered the road. Wounded men staggered forward, refusing evacuation to avoid weakening the line. Every mile cost blood. Richard responded not with speed, but rotation. Fresh units replaced the battered front. The wounded were moved inward, protected by shields and spears. The pace did not increase. The discipline did not loosen. Saladin expected panic. Instead, he saw adaptation. This was the moment the Sultan should have recognized the danger. The Crusader army was not breaking under pressure. It was hardening. The longer it endured, the more compressed its violence became. What Saladin interpreted as desperation was, in fact, tension coiling tighter with every hour. Day 6 brought crisis. Hospitaller commanders reported that their men were near collapse. Losses were severe. Morale was razor thin. Some spoke openly of charging with or without orders. Richard listened and refused. To charge now, before Saladin fully committed, would give the Sultan exactly what he wanted: a fragmented battle fought on his terms. Instead, Richard reinforced discipline one final time. He rode the line, visibly exhausted, bloodied like any other man. He reminded his commanders of the signal: 3 trumpet blasts, not before, not after, only then. That night, something subtle shifted. Saladin's attacks had failed to provoke the decisive mistake he had counted on. The Crusaders were still intact, still marching, still obeying orders under conditions that should have shattered them days earlier. The Sultan realized time was no longer his ally. If the Crusaders reached their fortified camp intact, the opportunity would be lost. Discipline had survived humiliation. Endurance had defeated erosion. Only one option remained. By the evening of September 6th, both commanders understood the truth, even if only one was prepared to act on it. The Crusader army was battered almost beyond recognition. Men were wounded, horses depleted, equipment damaged, nerves stretched to breaking point. 7 days of relentless pressure had stripped away illusion and comfort alike. What remained was something rarer and far more dangerous, an army that had learned it could endure. Saladin saw this clearly, and for the first time since the march began, doubt crept in. The harassment strategy that had destroyed so many Frankish hosts had failed to achieve its decisive effect. Discipline had not collapsed. The Crusaders were still moving as a unit. Worse, they were close, painfully close to safety. A fortified camp lay ahead. Once reached, the opportunity to destroy Richard's army in the open would be gone. Time, which had favored Saladin for 6 days, now turned against him. The Sultan faced a narrowing window. If he continued the war of attrition, the Crusaders would survive. If he disengaged, Richard would march on stronger than before, his aura magnified by survival itself. Only one option remained: total commitment. The entire Muslim host would have to strike at once, break the column in a single overwhelming assault, and roll it up before discipline could reassert control. That decision carried risk. Committing fully meant abandoning the safety of distance. It meant massing cavalry where it could no longer disengage freely. It meant betting everything on the assumption that the Crusaders, at the edge of collapse, would finally break when struck hard enough. Saladin believed they would. That same night, Richard gathered his commanders. No speeches are recorded. None were necessary. Everyone understood what dawn would bring. The pressure had built too long for any other outcome. Saladin would attack with everything he had. Not harassment, not probes, a decisive battle. Richard did not promise relief. He did not offer reassurance. He did not loosen discipline. The order remained unchanged. Hold formation until the signal. 3 trumpet blasts, not one less. This was the final act of restraint, and the most difficult. Men slept in armor. Knights lay beside dead horses. Wounded groaned softly in the dark. No one celebrated survival. No one spoke of victory. They waited. What Saladin could not see was what 7 days of enforced restraint had created. The Crusader army was no longer merely disciplined, it was compressed. Every suppressed instinct, every unreturned arrow, every fallen brother had accumulated into a single, contained force. Patience had ceased to be passive. It had become a weapon. When the sun rose on September 7th, there would be no gradual escalation, no testing of resolve, no retreat. One side would break, or both would be destroyed. The next 17 minutes would decide which. Dawn on September 7th broke without ceremony. No speeches, no omens, just heat, dust, and an army that had been pushed beyond exhaustion and held there by will alone. This time, Saladin did not test, he committed. From the hills, the full weight of the Muslim host descended. Roughly 30,000 warriors surged toward the Crusader column in coordinated waves. Drums thundered, horns sounded. The harassment of previous days gave way to sustained, concentrated assault. The intention was clear: shatter the rear, induce panic, and collapse the formation from the back forward. The Hospitallers bore the brunt.
Arrow fire intensified to a density unseen in the previous days. Horse archers closed to saber range. Casualties mounted rapidly. Horses screamed and went down in clusters, tearing gaps in the line. Knights fought to maintain spacing, to keep shields locked, to keep momentum forward, despite the chaos pressing inward. This was no longer erosion, it was annihilation attempted in slow motion. Saladin escalated again. One of his senior commanders led a direct, personal charge toward the Hospitaller standard. It was a calculated provocation, an insult designed to break the discipline that had survived 6 days of torment. The message was unmistakable: fight now or be destroyed without honor. For the Hospitallers, this was the breaking point. They had watched brothers die without response. They had marched under arrows for a week. They had obeyed orders that violated every instinct of the warrior's code. Now their line was being crushed deliberately, visibly, and publicly. The Hospitaller master reached his limit. Without waiting for the signal, without orders from Richard, he lowered his lance and charged. 300 armored knights surged forward in a single, involuntary motion. Discipline snapped, not across the army, but at one critical point. The most disciplined order in Christendom had finally acted on impulse.
For an instant, the entire crusade hung in balance. Richard saw it immediately. The Hospitallers were charging into superior numbers, unsupported, exactly as Saladin had intended. If recalled, they would be isolated and destroyed. If ignored, their destruction would unravel the entire formation. Either outcome meant catastrophe. This was the moment that separated command from collapse. Richard did not hesitate. He made the only decision that preserved coherence. He ordered the release. Trumpeters raised their instruments. 3 long blasts cut through the noise of battle, the sound every crusader had been conditioned to await for 7 agonizing days. What followed was not improvisation. It was controlled detonation. The unauthorized charge had not ruined the plan, it had triggered it. Saladin believed he had finally forced a mistake. In reality, he had committed his forces deeply enough to make withdrawal impossible. The trap was set. The weapon had been fully drawn. The next sound the Muslim army heard was not drums. It was 2,000 armored knights accelerating toward them as one. When the trumpet sounded, restraint ended everywhere at once. The Crusader cavalry did not surge forward as a mob. It moved as a machine finally released from tension. Nearly 2,000 knights accelerated simultaneously, maintaining formation even as they transitioned from endurance to violence. Hospitallers drove forward on the right, Templars on the left, with Richard and the mixed English and French knights forming the center. 3 iron wedges advanced, not chasing, not scattering, closing. For Saladin's army, the psychological shift was immediate and catastrophic. For 7 days, Muslim cavalry had dictated distance. They had decided when to approach and when to disengage. Now the dynamic inverted in seconds. The hunters became the hunted. The ground shook under thousands of hooves. Crusader war horses, bred and trained for shock, reached full gallop. Impact speed approached 35 miles per hour. At that velocity, a mounted knight became less a man than a projectile. Lances struck first, 12-foot shafts transferring the combined mass of rider and horse into a single point of force. What followed was not combat in the conventional sense. It was physics. The lighter Muslim cavalry could not absorb the momentum. Their line did not bend or break, it dissolved. Horses were smashed aside or crushed underfoot. Men were hurled from saddles, trampled before they could rise. Lances shattered on impact, but the knights did not slow. Swords came out immediately, cutting as the formations pushed through. Saladin's mistake became visible in real time. By committing his forces deeply in an attempt to break discipline, he had forfeited space. There was no room to withdraw, no time to reform. Mobility, the cornerstone of his doctrine, evaporated under the mass of disciplined shock. The Hospitallers tore through the wing that had tormented them for a week. Their charge was not merely tactical, it was psychological release. 7 days of suppressed rage detonated at once. Muslim units that had stood firm against countless lesser charges broke outright. Panic spread faster than orders. Richard's center smashed directly into the Mamluk corps. These were elite warriors, veterans of decades of warfare, but even they could not withstand the collision. The cohesion that had made them deadly dissolved under pressure they had never faced before. The Lionheart led from the front, his presence anchoring the formation as it drove forward without pause. The Templar struck moments later, angling inward to collapse the already fracturing flank. What emerged was a classic hammer and anvil effect, except it unfolded at a speed few medieval battles ever reached. Muslim units caught between converging wedges were annihilated where they stood. At this point, the battle ceased to be contestable. Saladin attempted to rally reserves, but momentum had already turned into terror. Men who had never fled before saw elite cavalry running and followed instinctively. Command signals vanished in the chaos. Dust clouds obscured everything except the relentless advance of ironclad horsemen. Richard ordered a second charge. This one was worse. With the Muslim line already collapsing, the renewed assault transformed retreat into rout. Knights pursued fleeing enemies for miles, cutting down stragglers and isolated groups. Crossbowmen advanced to finish those who fell behind. The killing only slowed when horses, blown from exertion, could no longer continue. From first impact to complete collapse, roughly 17 minutes passed. In that time, approximately 7,000 Muslim warriors were killed. Crusader losses during the charge were minimal. Fewer than 50 knights fell. Total Crusader casualties for the entire engagement, including the days of harassment, numbered around 700, mostly infantry. The numbers defied precedent. Medieval battles rarely produced such asymmetry. At Arsuf, an army lost not merely a fight, but its confidence, its doctrine, and its aura of inevitability in less time than it took to organize the assault. When the trumpets finally sounded recall, the plain was carpeted with bodies. Rich armor marked fallen emirs. Riderless horses wandered through the dust. The elite of Saladin's army, the force that had dominated the Holy Land since Hattin, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting body. Discipline had not merely won the battle, it had erased an entire way of war. When the killing stopped, the instinct of every knight on the field was the same: finish it. Saladin's army was in full flight, units were scattered, command cohesion had vanished, the Sultan himself had been forced from the field, his personal guard dragging him away from the collapsing center. In medieval warfare, this was the moment of absolute opportunity. A fleeing army could be annihilated, a war could be ended in a single afternoon. Richard refused. As knights regrouped and pressed for permission to pursue, the Lionheart issued an order that stunned both his allies and his enemies. Reform, collect the wounded, continue the march as planned. The decision appeared incomprehensible to men intoxicated by victory.
Jerusalem lay ahead. Saladin's aura had shattered. Another charge might capture the Sultan himself. But Richard understood something the battlefield did not reveal at first glance. The Crusader army was spent.
7 days of marching under fire, followed by repeated cavalry charges, had pushed men and horses to the edge of collapse. War horses, essential to any pursuit, were blown, many barely able to stand. Infantry were wounded, dehydrated, and scattered. Discipline had held, but only just. To chase into unknown terrain without formation and without rest risked reversing everything that had been gained. Richard's restraint in victory mirrored his restraint in endurance. He refused to allow impulse to undo discipline. Instead of chasing annihilation, he preserved coherence. The army reformed. Wounded were treated. Horses were watered. Order returned. The march to Arsuf continued exactly as planned, as if the greatest victory of the Crusade had been a scheduled event rather than a near catastrophe narrowly avoided. The strategic results were immediate. Jaffa, which Saladin had intended to defend, opened its gates without resistance when Richard approached. Garrisons along the coast began to negotiate rather than fight. The psychological balance of the campaign shifted in days, not months. Richard had won more than a battle. He had preserved an army capable of exploiting victory. Had he pursued and lost control, Arsuf might have become another Hattin, and overextension punished by reversal. Instead, discipline governed not only the charge, but its aftermath. This was the final proof that the battle's true weapon had never been cavalry. It had been command. The silence after Arsuf carried farther than the charge itself. Within days, the shock rippled across the Levant. Saladin's greatest strength, his aura of inevitability, had been shattered in full view of his commanders. Men who had never questioned his judgment began to whisper. Garrisons that once would have fought to the last man now weighed negotiation. The belief that Frankish knights could always be broken by patience and arrows died on the plain alongside 7,000 bodies. This was not merely a tactical defeat, it was doctrinal collapse. Before Arsuf, Muslim commanders believed mobility and attrition would always neutralize heavy cavalry. Richard proved the opposite. Disciplined shock, properly timed and perfectly restrained, remained the deadliest force in medieval warfare. European armies would study this lesson for generations. The idea of knights charging independently began to fade. Coordinated arms, infantry, missile troops, and cavalry acting as one became the new model. Saladin himself never forgot Arsuf. Though still a formidable leader, he avoided open battle with Richard thereafter. The remainder of the campaign became a war of sieges, maneuver, and negotiation. Jerusalem, once thought untouchable, entered the realm of bargaining rather than holy certainty. Yet Arsuf's deeper legacy extends beyond Crusade history. The principle Richard demonstrated, that absorbing punishment can force an enemy into overcommitment, reappears throughout military history. When patience becomes a weapon, numbers lose their meaning. Victory shifts from strength to timing, from aggression to control. Richard's greatest triumph was not the charge any knight could make, but the one he refused for 7 days. At Arsuf, 12,000 men defeated 30,000, not because they were stronger, faster, or braver, but because they endured longer and struck once perfectly. Discipline turned suffering into advantage. Restraint turned into annihilation.
The age of Saladin's invincibility ended in 17 minutes. Those minutes were purchased with 7 days of blood, heat, and silence. In war, as Richard proved, the most powerful weapon is not violence unleashed, but violence held until the exact moment it cannot be stopped.